So welcome to our second concurrent session. My name is Youngcho Lee, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. And I'm also one of the FemCon organizers and conveners of this conference. And I'm also the person that has been spamming everyone's inboxes with hundreds of emails. And I'll be serving as chair for this session. So this session is entitled Femininity, Masculinity, and Gender Identity. The presenters for the session are Lisa, Lena and Elias, and Elizabeth, and Anne is going to be serving as discussant. Our first presentation is going to be from Lisa, who's going to talk about exploring gendered practices by social position, the gender score applied to German population sample.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Youngcho. That's really nice. I really enjoyed all the contributions before, and I'm very happy to participate in this conference. So I'm Lisa. I'm a PhD student and research assistant at the School of Public Health at Bielefeld University. And I'm also part of the Gender Epidemiology Junior Research Group, where we are interested in operationalizing the sociological understanding of gender in social epidemiology and quantitative public health research. Maybe roughly speaking, social epidemiology is interested in how health and diseases are distributed in specific populations and how what determinants of health we see and how we can improve the health of populations in the end. And today, as Youngcho said, I would like to present our work on exploring gendered social practices by social position in a representative German population sample. So over the gender analysis in quantitative population health research is now increasingly encouraged to go beyond sex stratified analysis as it has been the standard before, but now is increasingly encouraged to also examine gender as a social construct, describing expectations, norms, roles, responsibilities, and power relations that fall upon individuals based on their presenting gender. And we were interested in how such understandings and approaches to gender as a social construct are operationalized. And we also did a scoping review on that and saw that there's a multitude of data collection instruments to assess social aspects of gender, and also routinely collected data that is frequently applied for gender analysis in public health research. But there are less opportunities for secondary data analysis. And in secondary data analysis, an approach that caught our interest is the approach of gender-related variables, which also gained increasing attention over the last decade. Approach is usually, it's like, broadly speaking, it uses variables that were not collected with the purpose to measure gender in survey data, but still those variables can tell us something about gender. And researchers applying this approach of gender-related variables use such variables telling us something about gender to measure gender beyond the sex variables that are usually available in survey data. But what we saw is that these approaches rarely explore the relational and intersectional dimension of gender, and understanding gender as a relational concept that can differ according to the cultural dimensions and other characteristics. And this was something we saw on the theory-informed level and also on the concrete operationalization of such characteristics. And we wanted to do an in-depth analysis for those. So we decided for the gender-related variables approach and used Peltier's methods to calculate a composite gender score. And for that, since we relied on the socioeconomic panel data, which is a representative survey in Germany, which only assesses sex assigned at birth with the binary categories female and male, we had to rely on this proxy to reflect on social practices referring to the gender that one identifies with or that one is seen as. And we were interested in how, or as a first step, which variables at first describe gendered practices in a representative German population sample, and how these gendered social practices then differ by social position. As I said, we wanted to put emphasis on the relational part of gender and the intersectional approach. And we mostly used visual exploration for our analysis here and used density plots of the gendered social practices by different social positions. So a bit on the gender score, because it's the core of the analysis. So what we did is, as I told you, we weren't able to, we had to rely on sex as a proxy for gender. And we first identified in a hand search gender-related variables in the socioeconomic panel, validated those variables that we identified in the hand search with bivariate analysis with a sex assigned at birth, and then came up with 29 variables that we included in a logistic regression model, and then in a stepwise backward regression exclusion, we excluded the variables that were not significant, and in the end we arrived at 13 variables defining our gender score, which you can see here. And we categorized them into those 3 dimensions based on the relational theory of gender, the symbolic relations, which contains, for example, norms, gender norms, the economic and power relations, which is about household responsibilities and employment opportunities, and the effective relations, which is about worries about crime and terrorism or the willingness to take risks. And those 13 variables that we identified in our final regression model we then calculated based on those coefficient estimates the propensity score to describe the probability of being categorized as female or male. And what you can see here is the distribution for the overall sample. You can see on the x-axis the continuum. Our score is a continuous score, so we have 2 poles, the masculine pole and the feminine pole, since we had sex as a binary variable, but we did not want to use a binary categorical variable, but wanted to have this continuous score. And as you can see, the gender social practices differ by sex assigned at birth. We see that at the both extremes of the gender score, you can see the peaks for each sex assigned at birth. But we also see that there's an overlap between males and females in the gendered social practices, which speaks to that those gendered social practices are also in part independent from the sex assigned at birth. So this is the gender score. And we then looked at it for different social positions. And we started with age, and it showed by all the social demographics we looked at, we saw one of the most pronounced differences by age. As you can see that the older the participants, we see that the higher or the clearer the differences between males and females and gendered social practices become, leaning towards each end of the both extremes, feminine and masculine gendered practices. But for the youngest age group, we see that there's far more overlap, especially for females leaning more towards the masculine gendered practices here. We also looked at the region of residence in Germany, and we saw that in West Germany, the differences by male and female was more pronounced compared to East Germany. We also checked the migration status, and here you can see at first the differentiation between migrant and non-migrant groups, and we see no clear differences for those being born in Germany and those not being born in Germany. And when we then have a closer look at within migrant groups, we differentiate it by region of origin, among others, and we see that for Western Europe, the male gendered practices are not as pronounced as for males from Middle East, Central Asia, or Eastern Europe. And then we also looked at partnership and parenthood related variables. And here we also saw clearly diverging patterns compared to the overall gender score I showed you first. And here we can see that those who were living in a same sex or gender partnership showed greater overlap compared to those who did not. And this is also comparable to the parenthood, where we can see that, where we can see a similar picture that those with no children showed greater overlap in gendered social practices compared to those who have children, be it cohabitating with children or not. So that's what we looked at and explored how gendered social practices might vary. And as we have seen from the density plots, we found empirical evidence that suggests that there are differences by social position in the gendered social practices. And this can be seen as explorative evidence for gender being a context-specific relational social construct. We saw that there were differences in gendered social practices by age, which could be an indicator that with a younger age, there is less adherence to traditional gender roles. It could also mean that the variables that were selected in the gender scope were not that meaningful for this age cohort to differentiate between male and female. Also by partnership, we saw strong differences in parenthood, which led us to the assumption that those two, especially starting a family and settling in, seem to have a strong effect on the gendered social practices. And we saw that as well in the variables that have been identified in the gender score. Their family status and family responsibilities were important indicators. But we saw less pronounced deviations in the gendered social practices for other social demographics, for example, formal education, income, and migration status. So the strengths and limitations of our analysis, and then I think I need to wrap up. So one strength of this analysis is that we used or created a composite gender score that assesses gendered social practices and norms on a femininity, masculinity continuum, thereby trying to avoid binary categories within the possibilities of secondary data analysis, of course. What we have to say about the limitations is that, of course, the selection of variables for the composite gender score is restricted by data availability issues. And also, we have to say that the items that we relied on, some of them might be gender biased. For example, as you might have seen when I showed the table with all the variables that define the gender score, there were only items on assessing attitudes towards working mothers, so-called working mothers, but not towards working fathers, for example. Also, our analysis provides cross-sectional data only, but the population we used is representative. Our analysis are of course explorative in nature, and this gender score has not been validated. but previous approaches that were similar indicated good face validity. So our conclusions are that there is a need for gender measures also in secondary data analysis that need to acknowledge gender as a context and population-specific social construct. Especially in the field of epidemiology and public health, we need greater inclusion of theory in gender analysis. And by identifying and monitoring markers driving heterogeneity between individuals related to sex and gender, we can more effectively dismantle and identify those systems of privilege and oppression in a broader sense. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I think your time management was perfect. We're next going to hear from Lena and Elias, who are going to give a joint presentation, I believe, on the subjective meaning of gender, how survey designs affect perceptions of femininity and masculinity.
Thank you so much. So my name is Lena Wangnerud, and I'm a professor in political science at the University of Gothenburg. And I will start off the presentation, and then Elias will take over. And we have two other co-authors, Monica Järpierre and Maria Solevid, who is also at the University of Gothenburg. So this paper, the title is The Subjective Meaning of Gender, How Survey Designs Affect Perceptions of Femininity and Masculinity. And this paper has already been published in a special issue from the European Journal of Politics and Gender. And the special issue is actually called Beyond the Binary, but the subtitle is New Approaches to Measuring Gender in Political Science Research. So the background for our paper is the long recognized need to improve measures of sex gender in large-scale surveys. In specific, we are dealing with measures that aim to conceptualize gender membership as a continuum rather than a dichotomy. And we use rating scales of femininity and masculinity, capturing respondents' self-conceptions on both these dimensions. And we base our study on two previous studies from our research group, one showing that non-categorical gender predict levels of anxiety, and one showing that non-categorical gender predicts certain political attitudes. And based on these findings, we wanted to know what is the content of these rating scales capturing gender on a continuum, and how stable are these scales to contextual factors? Next slide, please. And going back to one of the previous results, one of our key findings was an interaction effect between categorical and non-categorical gender. More female traits in women were significantly associated with higher levels of anxiety regarding social risks and threats. At the same time, there was no difference in anxiety levels between women and men with few female traits. Next slide, please. And moreover, an interaction effect between categorical and non-categorical gender was also a key finding in our second study. Here, we found that gender-conforming men and women leaned more to the right in the political ideology and were more traditional authoritarian in their values than gender non-conforming men and women. And one of the most important points in that paper was that these new gaps were sometimes larger than original attitudinal gaps between men and women. And now Elias takes over.
Thank you. So the research questions that we have guiding us in this research is first sort of more general, what are the perceptions of typical female and male traits? And then we move on to more specific questions, starting off with whether reasoning about typical gender traits prime how respondents place themselves on the rating scales that we use. And second, are the sequencing effects within the survey greater among men than women? We base this on this idea that masculinity is more performative in nature and those type of theories. And finally, how do self-categorization affect perceived similarities between the self and the out group? And so to do this, we use the Swedish Citizen Panel which is a large-scale, non-probability based online panel with pre-recruited respondents. It's from 2013 and about 1,500 respondents. It's highly male skewed, so representing the overall skew in the panel at that time. It's highly educated and with interests, so it's in a lot of ways similar to other panels of this kind. So the first instrument that we use here is the self-placement question. You can see here the question wording is: sometimes one talks about individuals having both female and male traits. To what extent would you say that you have female and male traits, respectively? And then they get to respond to both these perceived dimensions using the scale. I have few such traits to I have many such traits. And then we also have an open-ended content question asking: it is sometimes said that there are female and male traits and that people may have both female and male traits themselves. What do you consider being female and male traits, respectively? And we will move on to an experiment shortly, but I will first show you the sort of average placement on these self-placement scales and also the typical perceptions that we get. So first, the self-placement for the female respondents using self-identified gender. So we have the female respondents. They say that they place themselves on average on the 7th or 8th point on the scale. So close, they have more feminine traits than masculine traits, and they place that scale in smack dab in the middle. While for male respondents, we see pretty much the reversed. But we also see quite a lot of variation and nuance that they use using these trait scales. And we can also see that the variance of these different instruments is same and also between groups. So it's quite comparable in that sense. So in terms of proportion, mentioning different categories, we use this content coded, manually coded question. And we allowed respondents to have up to 3 characteristics or traits for each gender. And they were noted down and placed into different categories. And so these are very much in line with previous research like Koenig and also Alice Eagley and others in how what the distribution is. But we can see here that the most pronounced category for feminine traits is this communal category, which includes typical traits like care, feminine friendship. We also have this somewhat also large category, which is we call helpful, which includes keywords like understanding, cooperative, considerate. While for masculine traits, we can see that they give responses like being decisive, competitive, focused, and also forceful, strong, energetic. So those are very much in line with previous ideas. But we also get not only these kind of abstract personality type responses, but more what women and men do and what's the perception here. So we get a lot of responses on what being good at technical things or being good at cooking. So we call these the practical competence. But we also see some difference in terms of this emotional category, which includes like sensitive, caution, but also dominant and aggressive is more perceived to be a masculine trait. And we also have some critique of the question and sort of the idea itself, but also quite a few references to anatomical features and things like that. So moving on to the experiment itself, we have 2 treatment groups. In the first one, they got the self-placement items first, then followed up having this open-ended question where they got to say what types of traits they think that masculine and feminine is. And in the other treatment group, we have the reversed order. So in the first section here, we will look at we will compare this second treatment group, where we can view the open-ended question sort of as a treatment on the self-placement, self-placement, and then compared to the reference category, the other treatment group, where they have the self-placement not preceded by the open-ended question. And so these are the results. And remember, this is an 11-point scale. So a 0.5 here corresponds to half a scale point in difference. And so so this is compared to not having this open-ended question before. So having to reason about the content of these traits. So we can see that male respondents tend to give themselves more feminine traits when they are prompted to talk about the contents of the question, of the traits, and female respondents have the reverse effect. So this corresponds to about a fifth of a standard deviation. While the masculine traits is moving somewhat less, and for female respondents, not at all, while male respondents are quite significantly affected. So lots less masculine traits, almost a full scale point lower when reasoning about the contents. So we think that this is support for the first hypothesis, that there are indeed priming effects. They aren't maybe huge in size, but it's something to consider. We also get partial support for the second hypothesis, that men rate themselves less masculine, but this is not really true for women. And a possible explanation here of the results is having to verbalize these perceived typical gender traits makes these culturally constructed stereotypes and ideas of what it's like being masculine and feminine more evident to them, and would therefore trigger a more distinct difference between these gender stereotypes and oneself. But this is our idea of how we see this. And for the other experiment, the other sort of treatment we have here is when we look at the other effects of first placing themselves and what it means for how they perceive masculine and feminine traits being. And our hypothesis here was that we would see an accentuation, so a greater difference between one's group and the out group. And so this is to give you an overall idea of what happens with the feminine traits when they win. So it's the scale first here column that is sort of the treatment. So what happens when they first have to place themselves? And we can see that we get a more focus on the practical and less on the sort of abstract features. So less on actual traits and personality type-like responses, and more to what is being and doing rather than being woman and man. As we can see, if we divide this by female and male respondents, it's pretty much similar. And one way of thinking about whether we would see an outgroup difference is that the male respondents would perceive the feminine traits being even more sort of centered around one central feature. So, for example, that the communal trait would dominate even more, and we don't really see this. And for the masculine traits, we see pretty much the same, an increased focus on things like anatomy and similar features. So we think this we see that gender measurements are affected by question ordering to some extent, and having these self-placements first puts less emphasis on abstract traits and more on observable traits. And having the open-ended question first means that there's less emphasis on one's own gender performance. Another way of viewing this is thinking of it as we think that it's can be interpreted as having a collective frame when you start off with an open-ended question and reasoning about what is the sort of general features, general traits of these femininity and masculinity, while we get more individual frame when we have the self-placement first. We also see there is greater malleability among men, and this may reflect the distance taking to these sort of destructive forms of masculinity, which is taking place in Sweden too. We do not find extreme malleability, but there is indication that we do see effects, some ordering effects and other type of survey effects when using these survey instruments. And we also think that we see more biological reasoning than can be expected from social identity theory, basically. And that's all we have to present today. Thanks.
Thank you again for another really good time management and excellent presentation. The third and last presentation for this session is from Elizabeth, who's going to be talking about measuring gender diversity, the development and use of a new composite scale.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much to the previous presenters. Really fascinating papers there. So my paper explores, it's a very exploratory attempt to develop and pilot a new tool for measuring gender variance in survey research. And I've called this tool the Gender Variance Scale. So the tool was developed in the context of my doctoral research, which is a mixed methods sociological study that looks at the experiences of sex and gender diverse young people, so transgender, intersex, non-binary and gender non-conforming children and young people in health and education settings in the UK. And whilst developing the data collection tools for this mixed method study, I reflected on the same things that we're all here today to discuss, which is about, of course, how in the realm of social theory, we have very sophisticated and complicated and multifaceted models of gender in terms of applied sociological research. Statistical measures of gender still overwhelmingly rely on this simple categorical binary. And in these days, you might, in some surveys, get an extra 1 or 2 boxes like other or transgender. But for my survey, I wanted a much more nuanced and flexible measure of gender variance that could capture more diversity. And rather than just adding more categories, I really wanted a scalar tool that could measure diversity across trans and non-trans cisgender populations. So I started looking into what was out there in terms of gender scales. And I found that most scales out there have been developed in the context of psychological research, and that they tend to be extremely long, sometimes comprising 50 plus questions. So they aren't really scales that you can incorporate into a broader sociological survey, and they're more designed to be standalone measures. And they also tend to rely on asking questions that measure the extent to which people's personality, characteristics, or behavior align with traditional stereotyped ideas about gender roles and forms of gender expression. So I think earlier there was just the discussion of the very famous sex role inventory, which measures how masculine people are by asking, for example, whether they are analytical, competitive, and strong leaders. And to measure how feminine they ask questions like, are people yielding? Are they flatterable? Are they childlike? So anyway, these didn't seem to be the type of thing that I was seeking to measure in my study, which was more about kind of gender identity as a kind of psychic investment in self as a male or female or non-binary person. And we know that a person's adherence to traditional gender roles or stereotypes isn't necessarily a reliable predictor of their gender identity. And that masculinity norms and femininity norms and traits are highly variable across time, across cultures, across different social groups. So after some digging around, I found this slightly obscure measure from the 80s called the Sexual Identity Scale. And I like the scale for several reasons. Firstly, it sought to measure gender through self-perception. So it relies on a respondent's direct self-rating of themselves as typically masculine or feminine. And secondly, the scale is very short and simple. So it asks people to rate how gender typical they are across 4 simple domains: their interests, what they do, how they act, how they look, appear, and how they feel. So it's simple and brief, easily interpreted by respondent, and it can be incorporated into a broader survey. So using this tool as the basic architecture for my scale, I made some modifications to it. So most significantly, the original scale was bipolar. So people are asked to rank themselves on one continuum with masculine at one end and feminine on the other. So for my scale, I created 2 continuums, one for masculinity and one for femininity, to allow for the possibility for people to identify as neither masculine or feminine or both masculine and feminine. And this generated an independent masculine score and feminine score for each respondent. Secondly, I introduced a bit more variability to the scale. So instead of going from 1 to 5, it goes from 1 to 9. And third, I split the feel dimension of the scale into 2 parts. So respondents were first asked to assess the extent to which they feel masculine or feel feminine, and then the extent to which they feel male or feel female. This decision came from piloting the survey with a couple of focus groups of young people who took the survey and then were asked to kind of comment on their experience. So it was a decision that came out of that pilot, and then it allowed people to express feelings of femininity and masculinity, and that did not necessarily directly relate to their sex embodiment. And finally, each respondent was asked to answer a question about their sex registered at birth as recorded on their birth certificate. So as mentioned, responses to each item component were aggregated to create 2 separate scores for each respondent: a masculinity score from 5 to 45 and a femininity score ranging from 5 to 45. And here I've plotted these scores against each other based on my pilot of the survey. I'll explain a bit more about the sample in a minute. But as we can see, as expected, there's a strong inverse relationship between these 2 scores, with people who identify as strongly feminine tending to less identify as masculine. But there is variability within this and some outliers as well. So I then combined these scores to create a final kind of gender variance or transness score for each respondent, according to the formula on this slide. So it's if you're assigned male at birth, it's the inverse of the masculine score plus your feminine score, and the opposite if you're assigned female at birth. So what this scale does is it measures an individual's level of transgendered variance or their deviance from a prevailing cisgendered norm on a scale from 0, minimum possible variance, to 80, maximum possible variance. So a person assigned male at birth who has a high masculinity score and a low femininity score will have a very low gender variance score. They'll be highly gender conforming. So here I've plotted the distribution of the scale across 3 subpopulations in the sample I piloted on. So you can see for the cisgendered sample, there's a strong right skew with high concentrations around low levels of gender variance. For the binary trans population, you have the opposite with a strong left skew and a strong concentration around high levels of gender variance. And the non-binary gender diverse population has a more kind of evenly distributed normal distribution. So in terms of piloting this scale, so it's a sample of almost 800 young people ages 14 to 24 years who are asked to fill out the survey between 2019 and 20. It's a mixed sampling approach, so not representative, but it's still quite a large sample. So we've got about 1,500 respondents accessed through schools and further education colleges. 6 of these were selected randomly from an online directory, and the other 4 were through personal contacts. And then there's also an additional 267 young people who were recruited online through social media forums for gender and sex diverse children and youth. And this was to ensure that had a large enough sample of sex and gender variant young people. So I did several tests for validity on the scale, so I don't have a huge amount of time to go into detail, but I considered the relationship of the GVS score to a number of other comparison measures in the survey. So these included whether a respondent's gender identity matched their sex identified at birth, the extent to which a respondent said they identified with their birth sex, whether a respondent said they were suffering from gender dysphoria, whether a cisgender respondent said they were questioning their gender, and whether a respondent identified as binary or non-binary in the trans sample. And relationships were all as expected, with gender diverse youth as measured by other variables exhibiting significantly higher GVS scores than their gender typical peers. In terms of looking at the subcomponent masculine and feminine scores, the results indicated that respondents who identified as men and boys typically perceive themselves as masculine, and those who identify as women and girls perceive themselves as feminine. And there weren't any sort of significant correlations with those who identified as non-binary, other, or questioning. Pearson correlation also revealed a strong and significant inverse relationship between the masculinity and femininity scores, and this relationship was particularly strong for gender binary respondents and much weaker, but still significant for non-binary respondents. The 4 sub-dimensions of gender self-perception, feel, do, look, interests were tested in the SIS original paper, but as mentioned, the GVS differs in that respondents were asked this additional question on the feel component to separately assess whether they feel masculine and feminine compared to male and female. And t-tests revealed that the mean scores between these questions was significantly different for different gender populations, indicating that it was meaningful to ask 2 separate questions. Feeling male or feeling female was found to be a stronger predictor of gender identity than feeling masculine or feeling feminine. An assessment of internal consistency of the subcomponents of the GVS in terms of convex alpha showed a coefficient of greater than 0.95 for both the native female and the natal male populations, providing good evidence of the scale's reliability. So the second part of my paper moves on to applying the GVS, so exploring its associations with other demographic variables that were captured in the survey. As mentioned, one of the things that I think is interesting about the scale is that it can pick up variations in gender. So there was a really strong relationship between the GVS and sexuality. Significantly higher levels of gender variance as measured by the GVS were observed in the non-trans, lesbian, bisexual and gay population compared to the straight cisgender population, who are much more gender conforming. And meanwhile, trans youth in the sample were less likely than non-trans youth to identify as straight. So you can see the results for different sexual identities here, and they're quite striking. And I think these findings complement a body of theoretical feminist and queer literature, which has explored how heterosexuality regulates gender as a binary relation. So secondly, there was also a strong relationship with disability. So there were much higher levels of gender variance as measured by the GVS amongst the disabled cisgender population compared to the non-disabled cisgender population. And again, much higher rates of self-reported disability in the trans population compared to the cisgender population. And I found this relationship with disability quite interesting. The high empirical co-occurrence of forms of neurodiversity, particularly autism spectrum disorder, and gender variance is a topic of increasing academic interest and debate. So this study sort of lends further empirical weight to that relationship. And finally, associations were identified between the GVS and age, and the GVS and sex registration at birth. So there were lower levels of gender variance reported in younger adolescents compared to young adults. and significantly higher levels of gender variance observed in the cisgender female population compared to the cisgender male population. And I think these findings align with qualitative and theoretical literatures that have explored the especially inflexible and restrictive nature of constructs of masculinity, particularly amongst younger adolescents. So that might help sort of explain some of these patterns. And there were no associations observed between the GVS score and other measures such as ethnicity or socioeconomic factors, measures of deprivation. So just in terms of final thoughts, so the development of the GVS constitutes an exploratory effort to develop and test a new tool for measuring gender variance or conformity on a spectrum. The results of this first study, indicating both validity and reliability, suggest that the tool may be usefully applied across both gender typical and gender atypical populations to identify experiences of gender beyond a traditional male-female sex binary. The findings from the study may be of interest for building a stronger empirical understanding of gender diversity and its intersections with other aspects of identity. And at this stage, further empirical testing of the GVS would be valuable to better ascertain its usefulness. So thank you.
Thank you so much for keeping the time and also for that great presentation. Now we're going to invite Anne to discuss the 3 presentations in this session, and then we'll have some time left for questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for allowing me to respond to this. I'm going to just briefly reflect on the space in which we are, because it's a wonderful way to spend an afternoon of listening to all those presentations before I respond in slightly more detail about the papers themselves. And I'd like to finish by opening it up a little bit with some higher level questions. First of all, when I was preparing just for this session, I was really thinking about how fabulous it is that we have the opportunity to reflect and learn about our practice as feminist quantitative social scientists. And really, we should value and treasure this space. It's a space which is unique for me because it's really one of the few spaces where I have the opportunity to combine and very often the difficult task of reconciling feminist theory and the practical realities of conducting and applying quantitative methods. I think we have to realize that just like data have a context, so does the practice of feminist quantitative research. And we need to acknowledge that at the moment, particularly, it's nested within quite difficult debates about sex and gender that can very quickly become toxic and dangerous. So it's really useful to have a session like this one on the topic of femininity, masculinity, and gender identity. If I go a little bit in more details about each of the 3 presentations we've heard, just to try and summarize, and very much from my own subjective point of view. From Lisa's paper, I found the idea of constructing a gender propensity score based on a selection of variables a very, very interesting idea, and we see how useful it is to apply this. Indeed, when we assume that using sex at birth is an imperfect proxy for gender, it's possible that a propensity score is going to provide us with much more nuanced analysis that are going to go beyond the binary sex variable, which we are so used to seeing. The limitation of this, of course, and it's no reflection on the work of Lisa and colleagues, is the limited availability of the relevant variables that we have at our disposal when we're using secondary data. So what it really signals to me is the importance of calling, as we do always, for more gender-sensitive questions in large-scale surveys, such as the one that is being used in this research. What I found really interesting in this piece of work really was to see visually, it was so striking to see the graphs, the differences we see by family status, in particular the differences we see with partnership and parenthood, but also the ones we see with age and geographical locations. And really, if I could make a recommendation, something I would have liked to see more, of course, I have only seen the abstract, is I would have liked to understand more in terms of the family, in the sociological sense and across time and space. What are we going to be able to tell about this using this new measure? Then if I talk briefly about Lena and colleagues' work, I only read the abstract and not the published paper. So it might be that there is more information that is published that I know about. And this was actually very, very interesting because of the experimental aspect of this research and really the practical implications that it can have. As pointed out in the presentation in particular, what I found so interesting is the fact that when you prime men particularly, they have lower ratings of masculinity. And indeed, this is something that was picked up in the presentation. And it really might talk to the problematic identification of men with an idealized version of hegemonic masculinity, which I think Elias talked about, but using a slightly different wording than mine. One thing that I wondered when reading this was the fact that the paper suggested that the non-response is higher when gender self-categorization is presented first. And I was wondering what the implications would be in terms of fieldwork implementation and the requirements that we have to try and maximize response rates. So just maybe a little bit of the tension here, and I was left wondering what the authors might think of that tension. There's also the fact that self-categorization evens out the traits when they're presented first. And it's just really interesting to think about that, in my opinion, because it's the question that came to my mind was, can I interpret it as are we de-stereotyping gender? Overall, I just really found it just important and topical to discuss this. But it left me wondering, what are the implications for measuring gender and what would be the recommendations? Although I appreciate it might be in the paper, I just really wanted something a little bit more practical towards the end of it. And I think that having this discussion in this session is a really great way towards having this discussion in a more community of practice. In the third paper, Yarrow and colleagues are looking at how to develop a measure of gender diversity, and that is really consisting of a broader spectrum. What I really liked about this is that in adapting the previous framework, it is looking at feeling, looking, doing, and interest. And what is so novel about this is that it departs from the traditional approach that we see very often based on stereotypes, which are more pitched at the societal level and the macro level, and really to focus on individual measures of femininities and masculinities here, which I think are promising ways of looking at new gender measurements. Of interest also was, for me, the ability to see potential correspondence or the lack of correspondence in some cases between sex at birth, sex embodiment, femininity, and masculinity. In the abstract itself, I noted again, just maybe I was looking for more recommendations of how it might be used in further research. And then again, here in the presentation, it was just very nice to just see the applications to just other fields and other grounds of diversity later. So overall, if I just try and put this together, just first, I'd like to congratulate all the authors. It's just really wonderful work, and it's just a pleasure to just have the opportunity to engage with all of that work. It's really successful in responding to the need for more nuanced measurements of sex and gender. And it's really offering some very promising solutions using available empirical material. So maybe if I conclude with leaving you with three broad questions. My first one would be, how do we engage as feminist quantitative scholars when we are relying on primary data, when that can actually provide us with more opportunities to implement measures such as the one that have been presented? How do we, however, apply them when we're using secondary data? The second question that I wanted to raise was how can we engage in the design process to highlight these gender data gaps? And how can we make a contribution this way to better data collection by strengthening either a gender or feminist perspective in this process? And then finally, one of the questions that I wanted to raise is how do we do that in an age where we are facing sometimes very toxic debates on the boundaries of the concepts between sex and gender and, of course, other concepts that are related. And from this, their empirical measurements through quantitative approaches.
Thank you so much, Anne. I thought that was a really thoughtful commentary on the presentations. Sadly, our time for this session is up, but I'm really hoping that these conversations could continue on outside these sessions. And thank you so much for your really relevant and nuanced and original research and findings. And also thank you so much for Anne for your really thoughtful discussions. Thank you so much, everyone.